Settle in and get comfortable. Let your breath slow. Tonight we drift into the centuries many call the Dark Ages, not to chase battles but to move quietly through candlelit halls and along misty roads. A scribe bends over a page. A bell carries across a sleeping village. Waves press the shore in a steady rhythm. Before we dim the lamps, if this brings you rest, gently tap subscribe and leave a soft like so you can find your way back, and so someone else who needs sleep can find us too. As you listen, let the day loosen its grip. We'll visit kitchens warm with bread, markets at first light, chapels where footsteps echo, and fields where dew clings to grass. Names of kings will pass by like clouds. What remains is the simple shape of life, steady and human. If a detail catches you, keep it lightly and let the rest flow on. If sleep arrives, welcome it. You are safe here. Breathe in, breathe out. The candles are lit. The doors are closed against the wind. Our night journey begins. When people say Dark Ages, they usually mean the centuries after the Western Roman Empire fragmented. Most historians prefer early Middle Ages because the record shows both continuity and change. The phrase tells us more about later anxieties than about the period itself. As a convenient marker, many surveys begin in 476, when the military leader Odoacer removed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus at Ravenna and styled himself King of Italy. That change mattered symbolically, yet farmers still sowed and officials still counted rents. It is a beginning that helps us sort events rather than a fault line that the past itself could feel. Roman institutions did not vanish in a single season. Roads continued to carry carts and herds. Harvests rose and fell with weather rather than with edicts. Latin remained the language of law and liturgy in many districts, even as spoken vernaculars shifted. What altered quickly was the political map and the fiscal glue that had tied soldiers to emperors. New kingdoms formed inside old provinces. Gothic, Vandal and Frankish rulers kept elements of Roman administration, issued laws in Latin, and sometimes minted coins with imperial imagery. Daily life felt local, but it was threaded by habits and ideas that had traveled the Mediterranean for centuries. In the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire, based at Constantinople, pressed west again. Under Emperor Justinian, imperial armies reconquered parts of North Africa, Italy, and southern Spain. These campaigns rested on heavy taxation and careful logistics, and they proved hard to hold. In 541, a wave of bubonic plague moved through harbors and river towns, killing in great numbers in Constantinople and beyond. The historian Procopius described streets where bodies outpaced burial. Modern microbiology has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in victims from this pandemic, now called the Plague of Justinian. Environmental shocks compounded political strain. Tree ring studies and written observations suggest that the year 536 opened a period of unusual cooling across much of the northern hemisphere. Chroniclers noted a dim sun and poor harvests. Recent climate work links these reports to a cluster of large volcanic eruptions in 536, 540 and 547 that lofted aerosols and depressed summer temperatures for decades. Such cooling would have stressed yields and fisheries and nudged migration, trade and war in ways that scholars continue to test with new data. Communities answered uncertainty by building new forms of order. One of the most influential came from monastic life. Benedict of Nursia wrote a concise rule at Monte Cassino that balanced prayer, work, study, and hospitality. It discouraged extremes and tied accountability to an abbot elected for life. As the rule spread, monasteries organized time with bells, copied books in scriptoria, and turned farms and workshops into schools of virtue and literacy. Across centuries, the Benedictine pattern shaped daily routines, preserved texts, and trained administrators who moved between cloister and court. The Atlantic edge nurtured even starker experiments. On Skellig Michael off the Kerry coast, Monks terraced small gardens and built beehive huts from dry stone, a community poised between sea and sky. The survival of the complex testifies to skill and stubbornness in the face of wind and salt. Island houses like this served as way stations for pilgrims and scribes who carried books and stories between Ireland and Britain. Books were works of art and devotion, as well as tools of teaching. In the early 8th century, monks at Lindisfarne produced an illuminated gospel that blended Mediterranean, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon visual languages. Carpet pages dense with knotwork and creatures invited sustained looking as part of prayer. The book reveals cross-cultural exchange and a discipline formed by long practice. It is a reminder that the so-called darkness contained patient light inside small rooms near the sea. Archaeology has widened and corrected this picture. The ship burial uncovered at Sutton Hoo in 1939 revealed a chamber rich with silver from the eastern Mediterranean, garnets routed through long-distance trade, and an iron helmet with intricate fittings. The find suggested the wealth and reach of an early 7th century East Anglian court and challenged older images of a uniformly poor and isolated era. Collections and object catalogues continue to refine provenances and trade routes that stitched Britain to Scandinavia and the wider Mediterranean. Violence remained part of life, though its pattern varied. Monasteries were not always safe. In 793, raiders from the north attacked Lindisfarne, shocking contemporaries who read the event as a warning. The community endured and recorded its story in stone and parchment, but the raid announced that the political weather was changing. In the decades that followed, Scandinavian ships threaded rivers and coasts, adding new forms of warfare, trade, and tribute, and reshaping power in the islands. Religious change linked distant shores. In 597, missionaries from Rome reached Kent, while ascetic networks from Iona and Ireland worked through the north and west. These strands met in conversation and sometimes in competition, as at the Synod of Whitby in 664, where Northumbrian leaders debated calendars and custom and chose to follow Roman practice. Such decisions mattered beyond liturgy because monasteries carried law, letters, and craft. Figures like Bede wrote history with careful dates and sources, showing that scholarship survived by adapting to new patrons and new political weather. If we listen to these centuries patiently, we hear many registers. We hear the Latin of laws and sermons, the Old Irish of poems, and the Old English of laments. We see amphorae carried along sea lanes that never fully closed, and hilltop churches raised on Roman foundations. Villagers were not characters wandering at twilight between civilizations. They were families, farmers, craftspeople, monks, and rulers making practical choices under pressure. The evidence they left is uneven, but it is enough to trace patterns of resilience and invention that will guide the rest of this account. In that sense, the era was twilight and dawn together. Merovingian Gaul and its neighbors in the later 6th and 7th centuries show how institutions could bend without breaking. In former Roman provinces, Frankish rulers inherited a civic skeleton of cities, bishops, roads, and courts. Charters in Latin continued to record gifts and disputes, counts still gathered dues and presided at assemblies, and bishops kept libraries, shrines, and lines of communication that joined courts to communities. Much of that machinery looked Roman because it had been Roman. What changed most was the pattern of authority. Royal households moved with the seasons and with war, stitching loyalty through gifts, oaths, and travel, rather than through a single standing bureaucracy. Merovingian succession customs made politics unusually sharp. Kingdoms were often divided among sons, and rival branches sought advantage through marriage, ambush, and alliance. Two queens stand out. Brunhild of Austrasia ruled as regent for her descendants, promoted roads and churches, and backed bishops who supported her program. Her rival, Fredegund of Neustria, fought for her son's survival with diplomacy, and, at times, violence. Writers were not neutral, yet even hostile accounts show queens acting as regents, patrons and commanders of policy. Their stories remind us that high politics could be personal without being trivial. Across the Pyrenees, the Visigothic kingdom pursued stability through law. In 654, King Receswinthe promulgated the Liber Judiciorum, a code that drew on Roman jurisprudence and was written in Latin. It set rules for property, marriage, inheritance and crime that applied to Goths and Hispano-Romans alike, and later, kings revised it to keep pace with practice. The book is a good example of continuity channeled through local needs, a late antique legal culture adapted to a new political map. Italy followed a different path after Justinian's reconquests faltered. The Lombards entered the peninsula in 568 and organized a kingdom whose political center later settled at Pavia. Power ran through dukes and local officers, while Byzantine enclaves held the exarchate at Ravenna and strips of the south. The papacy learned to balance letters to distant emperors with negotiations nearer at hand. This setting produced a dense paper trail of charters and immunities and a literature of saints, lives in which abbots and bishops ransomed captives and managed local order. Religious networks tied these regions together. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine and a band of monks to Kent. King Ethelbert received them, permitted worship at St. Martin's Church, and granted land for a monastery at Canterbury. In the same generation, Irish asceticism pushed outward on its own lines. The abbot Columbanus founded Luxeuil in Burgundian territory and later Bobbio in Lombard Italy, traveling with books, a strict monastic rule, and a lively pen he used in letters to kings and popes. These missions met local politics, sometimes gently and sometimes with friction, but together they carried schools, scriptoria, and new habits of timekeeping. Agriculture financed everything from royal gifts to gospel books. Across much of Europe, farmers used a light ard to scratch furrows, sowed winter and spring grain, weeded, then folded livestock onto fallow plots so manure could feed the soil. The dominant rhythm was a two-field rotation that balanced risk and labor. In heavier northern loams, a wheeled moldboard plough promised deeper turning and better drainage, but most evidence suggests that heavy ploughs became widespread only toward the end of the first millennium. That timing matters because it locates many of the big agricultural gains later than our period, while reminding us how much early medieval communities achieved with simpler tools. Exchange reached farther than a village horizon. From the 7th century, new trading settlements known as emporia or wicks appeared at river mouths and along tidal channels. Dorestad on the Rhine, Hamwick at Southampton, Londonwich near the Thames, and Ribe in Jutland combined workshops with quays and lanes of timber plots. They looked planned, but were not old Roman towns. Archaeology shows short lifespans, a focus on craft and transit, and few stone monuments. Their sites at the edges of kingdoms made sense, close to customs posts, harbours, and river junctions where rulers could tax movement and artisans could find buyers. Veins make these linkages tangible. Excavations at Hamwick have produced imported pottery and glass, alongside smithing and bone working, evidence for a craft economy tied to distant suppliers. In East Anglia, the ship burial at Sutton Hoo, probably early 7th century, yielded silver vessels likely made in the eastern Mediterranean. Garnet cloisonne set in gold fittings with stones routed from South Asia, and a famous iron and bronze helmet with gilded mounts. The assemblage signals connections that stretched from Britain to the Baltic and the Mediterranean. It also shows how rulers converted surplus into messages about rank, alliance, and the past. For most people, home was a 1 or 2 room building of wattle and daub under a thatched roof. Smoke from a central hearth blackened rafters and helped cure meat and seed. Families often penned animals at one end of the room for warmth and safety during winter nights. Diets leaned on cereals made into bread, pottage, and ale, with greens from garden strips, dairy, eggs and occasional meat, while rivers and coasts added fish where they could. Obligations to lords and churches were paid in labour days, in kind, and in dues of produce, all of which turned time into rent. Judging such households by later standards misses the point. The better measure is the range of choices within constraint. Families balanced seed against fodder, chose between keeping a weak calf or salting its meat, and decided whether to send a teenager to serve in a greater household to learn craft or letters. Women spun wool, brewed ale, managed dairies, and tended gardens while carrying the knowledge that stitched meals and medicine together. Men's work overlapped much of this and added the heaviest ploughing and carting, though the division of labour varied by place and season. Together, such choices made resilience a habit rather than a slogan. Taken together, these strands explain how order grew across political fragmentation. A queen's regency in Gaul, a law code in Hispania, Lombard dukes in Italy, and missions from Rome and Ireland were not separate anecdotes. They formed a flexible toolkit that communities used to plan harvests, settle disputes, guard sacred places, and host traders at river quays. The light from this era came from many small sources. It glowed from hearths and scriptoria, from markets at the tideline, and from the steady work of people who expected little from distant capitals and much from their own hands. The Carolingians drew a wider order from local pieces by pairing military force with church partnership and written rule. After Charles Martel's death in 741, his sons Carloman and Pippin split offices. In 751, Pippin III displaced the last Merovingian figurehead and took the royal title with episcopal backing. In 754, Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps, anointed Pippin and his sons, and confirmed an alliance that would draw Frankish armies into Italy. That partnership soon carried territorial consequences that outlived any one campaign, because it linked ritual, policy, and land. Charlemagne became sole ruler in 771 and quickly reshaped the map. In 773, he answered appeals from Pope Adrian I, crossed the Alps, and besieged the Lombard capital at Pavia. In 774, he took the Iron Crown and styled himself King of the Franks and of the Lombards, recognizing Italian distinctiveness while integrating institutions into his system. To the northeast, he removed Duke Tassilo of Bavaria in 788 and tightened supervision of that duchy. East of the Alps, he fought the Avars and opened their ring fortresses, converting treasure into gifts and pay that held followers close. The longest conflict lay in Saxony. For decades, Frankish forces pressed against a patchwork of leaders who defended autonomy and sacred sites. Early decrees linked submission to baptism and set heavy penalties for destroying churches or refusing Christian rites. Later measures softened that pattern, emphasizing persuasion, settlement, and parishes. The change did not erase coercion, but it shows rulers learning that rule endured best when punishment turned into routine. New bishoprics and royal estates followed the line of march, forming a mesh of places where priests, reeves, and judges could do steady work. Holding required paperwork. Carolingian courts multiplied documents to clarify commands and learn what local officers were doing. The capitulary, a set of numbered articles grouped by topic, became a regular instrument for broadcasting the king's will and adjusting practice. Counts held counties, bishops held sees, and each owed service that could be measured in courts held, men raised and dues gathered. To keep the gears meshed, Charlemagne regularized royal envoys known as missi dominici, often a cleric paired with a lay noble who rode circuits to listen, inspect, and correct. They made local justice audible at court and made court policy legible in the provinces. Religious and educational policy formed the other half of this order. In 789, Charlemagne issued the Admonitio Generalis, a comprehensive capitulary that set aims for teaching, preaching, and discipline across the realm. It instructed bishops and abbots to establish schools, correct books, and teach the basics of belief, prayer and moral life. Councils summoned at royal command translated aims into canons, and capitularies gave those canons legal weight. The court signaled priorities by recruiting scholars from many regions and by giving them authority to review texts, gloss difficult passages, and model instruction. One recruit was Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian teacher invited in 781, who later directed the palace school at Aachen. Under his guidance, students worked through the liberal arts as a scaffold for theology and administration. Letters circulated between court and monasteries with questions and model answers. Catalogues, florilegia, and corrected texts multiplied. Writing became a shared craft, and grammar a tool for governing. The Carolingian court did not create universities, but it coordinated classrooms across a large space and gave reasons, rewards, and materials for teaching that endured beyond a single reign. Script itself became a technology of reform. Scribes refined a rounded, even hand that modern scholars call Carolingian minuscule. It set clear letter heights, separated words, and used regular punctuation. The hand drew on late Roman and insular habits, but smoothed them into a form that could be copied widely. By the early 9th century, it spread through cathedral and monastic workshops, with places such as Tours playing an important role. Legibility made copying faster, reduced errors, and let traveling readers pass fluidly between libraries. The look of a page became part of the reforming message. Money was another instrument. Around 793 or 794, Charlemagne reformed coinage by fixing a silver standard and issuing deniers in large numbers. Gold had grown scarce within the Frankish orbit, while silver could be mined north of the Alps or traded in quantity. The reforms set common weights and made dues, tolls, and exchange easier to account for. Merchants counted in new units, and officials recorded renders against a measure that could be checked. A pound of silver was subdivided into predictable parts. Stamped legends told everyone whose authority guaranteed the coin, and that promise traveled with it. Architecture expressed the same ambition in stone. At Aachen, the palace complex centered on an octagonal chapel designed by Odo of Metz. The plan drew on San Vitale at Ravenna and on Byzantine models, yet the heavy piers and double-shell dome spoke a northern grammar. Consecrated in 805, the chapel later became a coronation site for German kings and a focus for memory. It anchored an itinerant court with a place that embodied claims to Roman inheritance and Christian empire. Visitors encountered measured space, calculated light, and a throne set to look across the octagon toward the altar. These moves reached into daily routines. Parish priests had more texts to read and correct. Local courts saw inspectors ask questions and hear complaints. Monasteries trained more boys to read and chant. Traders handled deniers and counted tolls in new units. None of this made life steady. Rebellion, famine, and private violence continued. Yet order thickened. People used to local ties could now appeal to texts, to envoys, and to rules that traveled farther than a single valley. By 800, those habits framed expectation as much as banners or bells. Our view of this order rests on varied evidence. Charters and capitularies reveal language, procedure, and the kinds of problems rulers hope to solve. Coins and hoards show monetary policy in metal. Buildings like the chapel at Aachen show how ideas were staged. Narrative sources give motion and motive. Einhard, a courtier who later wrote the life of Charlemagne, left a portrait of a ruler who mixed war, piety, and administration with personal habits of study and conversation. His account is careful and partisan, but it confirms from within what the documents show from outside. By the year 800, these strands met in a new title. Pope Leo III, threatened in Rome in 799, sought Charlemagne's protection. On Christmas Day 800, during Mass at St. Peter's, Leo placed an imperial crown on Charlemagne's head and hailed him as Emperor of the Romans. The gesture announced that imperial dignity could be located in the Latin West again, and it raised questions about who bestowed such titles and to what end. Charlemagne later tried to shape the symbolism by staging a public succession for his son. The next decades would test them through distance, succession, and new frontiers, but the framework they built endured beyond individual reigns and memories. When Charlemagne died in 814, his son Louis inherited an empire wide on parchment and delicate at the joints. Louis the Pious had already ruled in Aquitaine and knew the strain of distance. He favored a devotional court culture, leaned on bishops and experienced counts, and turned reform from a single great push into a routine of councils, capitularies, and inspections. Early in the reign, he brought Benedict of Aniane to coordinate monastic observance, reasoning that a common discipline in monasteries would shape the people who staffed churches, schools, and local administration. Succession soon made every administrative choice harder. In 817, Louis issued the Ordinatio Imperii, naming his eldest Lothar as co-emperor and senior partner, while Pepin received Aquitaine and Louis the German held Bavaria as sub-kings. The plan assumed that fraternal cooperation could preserve unity under a visible hierarchy. It also assumed the family was complete. In 823, a new son, Charles the Bald, was born to Judith. Older brothers feared their shares might shrink, and factions formed around mothers, tutors, and regional alliances. Arguments about land and loyalty shaded quickly into questions about principle. Open conflict followed. In 830, magnates rallied behind the elder sons and moved against Judith and her circle. In 833, the princes forced Louis to submit at a place remembered as the Field of Lies. The emperor performed public penance and briefly lost his title. The coalition then unraveled. Pepin died, regional interests diverged, and supporters drifted. By 834, Louis was restored, Judith returned to influence, and the court once more tried to bind unity with oaths, partitions, and carefully staged reconciliations. The sequence shows how fragile large claims could be when trust ran through families as much as institutions. From this turmoil, we gain unusually clear documents. In February 842, after Louis's death, Charles the Bald and Louis the German swore mutual oaths at Strasbourg against Lothar. They had their followers repeat the pledges aloud in two vernaculars, one Romance and one Germanic, so that soldiers would understand what they promised. These short texts are among the earliest continuous sentences we possess in those languages. They announce a ruler's concern for the comprehension of a mixed army and help us see how spoken tongues had drifted from classroom Latin into distinct regional speech. The settlement of 843 is known as the Treaty of Verdun. Lothar kept the imperial title and a long middle kingdom that ran from the North Sea through the Rhineland and Burgundy into Italy. Charles took the western realm later called West Francia. Louis the German received the eastern realm later called East Francia. These borders did not end the matter. Lothar split the middle block among his three sons in 855, creating separate kingdoms in Italy, Provence, and a strip from the North Sea through the Meuse and Moselle that later writers would call Lotharingia. Further adjustments, including Meersen in 870, followed deaths and claims. These political changes altered daily life even where fields and churches looked the same. Counts and bishops still answered to kings, but distance made answers slower and loyalties more local. Immunities granted to churches and monasteries removed large territories from comital courts, placing more judicial and fiscal authority inside ecclesiastical precincts. Aristocratic families increasingly treated counties as heritable resources rather than as offices held at pleasure. Donation charters and cartularies show lay lords founding proprietary monasteries that reinforced family power while offering spiritual patronage and local welfare. External pressure exposed the seams. Scandinavian fleets probed coasts and rivers in growing numbers. Raiding was not new, yet its range and tempo changed. In 845, a fleet rode up the Seine and took payment at Paris. In 851, raiders struck the Lower Loire. By 858, they wintered on the Seine, and by 859 on the Loire, turning quick strikes into seasonal bases. Some leaders accepted subsidies and service as royal allies and fought other Vikings or rebellious counts. Others took land by bargain, guarded crossings, and married locally. The river routes that made trade efficient also made violence mobile. Southern and eastern borders faced different tests. Fleets from North Africa and Sicily disrupted coastal trade and at times seized strongholds, as at Bari in the middle of the 9th century. In the northeast, Slavic polities along the Elbe and Oder traded, negotiated and fought with Frankish lords and missionaries, while east of the Alps, Great Moravia grew as a regional power and a field for competing church missions. Late in the century, groups we call Magyars moved into the Carpathian Basin and began raiding across East Francia and northern Italy, adding a fast cavalry threat to the long list of frontier concerns. Administration adapted at the edges. The idea of the march became more explicit, meaning belts of counties tasked with defense and diplomacy. In the southwest, the Spanish march guarded the Pyrenean passes and the Ebro line. In the northwest, the Breton march tried to steer a peninsula attached by habit and by stubbornness rather than by roads. To the east, frontier counties anchored river crossings toward Bohemia and Moravia. Marcher lords collected tolls, built timber and stoneworks, recruited garrisons, and bargained with neighbors. They needed license to improvise, which made them useful and sometimes unpredictable. Conflict did not end intellectual work. Royal courts continued to summon bishops and abbots to legislate on preaching, schools, and discipline. Cathedral and monastic scriptoria produced books in a mature Carolingian hand that set the page in clear lines and made copying more efficient. Writers shaped memory of recent struggles, defending one brother or another, while communities raised saints whose cults gave language for loss, healing, and gratitude. Monasteries acted as banks, archives, hostels, and workshops, as well as houses of prayer, and they trained the clerks who kept charters and adjudicated disputes. Exchange remained lively on the long routes. The North Sea and Baltic knit Scandinavia, Frisia, and the British Isles into a circuit where silver dirhams from Islamic mints moved through many hands. Furs, slaves, and walrus ivory left northern ports, while glass beads, cloth, wine, and metalwork flowed back. The Rhone and Saône corridor connected Mediterranean cargoes to the north. Alpine passes linked Italian towns to markets on the plain. Earlier reforms of weights, measures, and coin standards helped strangers settle accounts, while local fairs and river quays turned distant policy into practical routine. The language of empire still mattered, even as practice drifted. Kings, counts, and bishops read the same law books, struck similar coins, and prayed from related liturgical texts. They also bargained with local magnates using older tools of gift, office, and marriage. Charters invoked Roman continuity and Christian duty, yet power pooled around whoever could summon riders to a ford at short notice. The habit of inspection by royal envoys weakened, and great families learned to make their own peace with neighbors and rivals. In many districts, county and monastery became the most reliable engines of order. By the 860s and 870s, the map looked less like a single empire than a family of linked kingdoms. Ideas that had animated earlier reform survived in books, buildings, and schools, while the structures that carried those ideas stretched and frayed. What emerged was not collapse so much as diffusion. Authority moved across many hands and many rooms. This is the setting for the next turn of the story, which follows reformers who tried to rescue unity on paper, captains who carved river principalities, and new peoples on the steppe edge who tested every promise documents could make. In the middle decades of the 9th and 10th centuries, power in Western Eurasia reorganized along rivers, coasts, and frontier belts. Mobile raiders tested every weak joint, while kings, counts, bishops, and abbots answered with forts, treaties, and new forms of cooperation. The picture looks turbulent if we trace only battles. If we widen the lens to show paperwork, ports, and parishes, we see how repeated shocks produced institutions that would shape the next centuries. The most dramatic pressure in the British Isles came from Scandinavian armies. In 865, a large coalition, remembered in English sources as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records their wintering and movement through Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, a sustained campaign rather than a single seasonal raid. Archaeology has reinforced this view by identifying winter camps and trading grounds where metalworking, gaming pieces, and bullion circulated alongside weapons, showing that the force functioned as a mobile community with markets as well as warbands. The pivot in Wessex came in 878 after Alfred's victory at Edington. Later tradition speaks of a Treaty of Wedmore, but no such charter survives. Contemporary evidence rests on Asa S. Life of Alfred and on a related document preserved from the same years, the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, which set borders and terms for peace between English and Danish leaders. The debate about where and how the agreement was made matters less than the durable results. Baptism, hostages, and districts of law were the tools by which war was turned into predictable coexistence. Alfred's long answer to shock was not only a field army, but a map. The Burgle Heidage lists a ring of fortified towns, each assigned a tax burden proportional to the length of its ramparts. These burhs guarded river routes, stored grain, hosted markets, and anchored shires. The document survives in multiple versions, but its logic is clear. If enemies moved by water and rode fast inland, reply with a network near crossings and fords, then make every household share the cost. The scheme stretched into the next reigns, when Edward the Elder and his sister Ethelfled extended burhs over Mercia. Alfred linked walls to words. Asser and later compilers preserve his program of translating key Latin works, most famously Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, and sending copies to bishops for use in clerical training. The idea was not antiquarian. It treated literacy as infrastructure for preaching, courts, and royal orders. Books corrected law and liturgy the way a ditch corrected a riverbed. With that base, consolidation quickened. Under Edward and then under Athelstan, English rulers took London, pressed north, and folded former Viking territories into a larger commonwealth. Athelstan's seizure of York in 927 made him the first ruler to command all English lands for a time, a claim tested at Brunanburh in 937, where he defeated a coalition from Dublin, Scotland, and Strathclyde. Later memory made the battle a poem. Administrative traces, coins, and charters made it policy. Across the Irish Sea, Scandinavians made different kinds of footholds. The annals of Ulster and the archaeology of Dublin show that by 841, a long fort at the junction of the Liffey and Poddle had become a year-round base. Norse leaders raided and traded, married into Irish dynasties, and turned piracy into port dues and craft neighborhoods. Power in Ireland remained polycentric, but the ports created new brokers among Norse Gael families who spoke both legal languages. Farther into the North Atlantic, settlement in Iceland began around 874 and culminated with the establishment of the Althing in the 930s, an assembly that coordinated law and judgment across dispersed farmsteads. Later sagas color the picture, yet the main frame is stable, a frontier society that made consensus and recitation do the work of stone courthouses. On the lower Seine, Frankish responses mixed payment with placement. In 911, Charles the Simple reached an accord with the Viking leader Rollo after years of pressure on Paris and Chartres. The specific treaty text does not survive, but narrative sources and later charters show that lands along the Seine were granted in exchange for defense and baptism. That settlement began the duchy we call Normandy. Its rulers turned river mastery into cavalry, castles, and a culture that fused Scandinavian, Frankish, and ecclesiastical habits into one of the most vigorous principalities of the 10th and 11th centuries. Frontiers to the south and east had their own tempos. In Provence, a Muslim stronghold at Fraxinetum controlled alpine passes and raided deep into valleys until the 970s, a reminder that the Mediterranean's violence did not end with the 8th century. To the southwest, the Spanish March, a Carolingian creation on the far side of the Pyrenees, evolved into counties with their own identities and strategies, including Barcelona's long climb toward independence. These were belts where counts bargained with kings and where fortresses, tolls, and pilgrim hostels did more governing than capitals. In Iberia, a different consolidation reached its peak. In 1929, Abd al-Rahman III of Córdoba adopted the caliphal title, signaling independence from eastern rivals and crowning a generation of administrative and military recovery. Sources emphasize Córdoba's urban scale and cultural magnetism in the 10th century, with court scholars, artisans, and builders shaping a city that impressed friends and enemies alike. Long-distance trade, irrigation, and minted coin supported this brilliance. The point for our story is contact. Diplomatic exchanges tied Córdoba to Christian courts north of the Duero, to Italian towns, and to North Africa. Pilgrimage knotted these geographies together. In the early 9th century, Christian sources in Asturias reported the discovery of the tomb of the Apostle James. Royal patronage built churches at the site, and by the 10th century, routes converging on Santiago de Compostela were drawing travelers from beyond the peninsula. Recent scientific work on the remains of Bishop Teodomiro, the prelate linked to that discovery, has given the old story a firmer historical contour. Whatever individuals believed about relics, roads, and hostels grew to serve them. And those roads moved news, money, and habits across the mountains. East Francia faced its own mobile enemy. Magyar raiders rode out of the Carpathian Basin along the Danube and into Italy and Bavaria. In 955, Otto I won a decisive victory at the Lechfeld. That success ended large-scale Magyar incursions into Germany and opened the way for a program that bound bishops more tightly to royal policy. 7 years later, in 962, Otto took the imperial crown in Rome and codified relations with the papacy. His heirs would debate the meaning of empire, but the mechanics were clear. Military success, episcopal administration, and ritual at Rome combined into a fabric of rule that held together a kingdom otherwise stretched by distance. By the 980s and 990s, new dynasties were rising to match these conditions. In West Francia, the election of Hugh Capet in 987 confirmed that kingship could move by the choice of leading magnates when Carolingian lines failed. The Capetians began modestly, holding Paris and the Seine Valley, while learning to knit a wider realm with marriages, alliances, and careful support of churches. Taken together, these episodes show how the so-called dark centuries generated light by friction. Recurrent danger produced fortified towns, negotiated marches, teaching programs, and new titles that could travel farther than a single household. Rivers that carried raiders also carried reform. Ports that once paid tribute became capitals. The next segments will follow how these structures matured and how reformers used liturgy, law, and monastic networks to quiet violence into custom. In the 10th century, reform moved not from a single capital, but from choirs and chapter houses. Two currents became especially influential. One flowed from Burgundy through the Abbey of Cluny. The other rose from Lorraine around the community of Gauze. Both claimed to restore the rule of Saint Benedict. Each did so with different emphases that shaped law, economy, and art well beyond monastic walls. Cluny began in 910, when William the Pious, Duke of Aquitaine, endowed a house at a small Burgundian town and placed it under the protection of Saints Peter and Paul. That formula, repeated in papal confirmations, meant freedom from lay control and a direct line to Rome. The choice mattered because it insulated the abbey from local magnates who often treated religious houses as family property. Early abbots, beginning with Brno and followed by Odo, built prestige on strict observance, careful governance, and the ability to receive gifts while promising spiritual benefits for donors. The network that formed from daughter houses and priories turned Cluny into a model many sought to imitate or resist. Cluniac practice tilted toward a long and solemn liturgy. Monks sang the full round of offices with elaboration, added commemorations for benefactors, and developed a theology of memory that linked property to prayer. This was not empty pageantry. It organized time, trained voices to a common rule, and made the monastery a public place where lay people could witness ordered worship. Within that horizon, Odilo of Cluny is credited with fixing November 2nd as a day for general intercession for the dead, a practice that spread widely through the West in the following centuries. Some scholars place Odilo's decree around 998 for Cluniac houses, while others argue the observance crystallized after 1030. Either way, the emphasis on remembrance deepened ties between communities and those who endowed them. Gorze, near Metz, pursued reform with different accents. From the 930s, the community and its allies promoted a return to disciplined Benedictine life with less weight on ceremonial expansion and more on internal correction and pastoral usefulness. Figures like John of Gauze modeled learned administration and diplomacy alongside ascetic practice, and the movement influenced houses across Lotharingia and the German kingdoms. Contemporary church historians routinely pair Cluny and Gauze as the twin poles of a wider renewal. The pairing helps us see that reform was plural, regionally shaped, and often collaborative across political boundaries. These reforms were legal as well as spiritual. Papal privileges and royal charters granted immunities and exemptions to monasteries, removing large precincts from comital courts and fiscal claims. Abbots and bishops thus gained judicial authority within their lands, managed markets and tolls, and maintained archives of gifts and disputes in cartularies. The law on parchment set expectations on the ground. It regularized rents, guarded endowments meant to feed communities and pilgrims, and gave local elites a way to convert surplus into a reputation for piety. This administrative dimension explains why reform mattered to lay rulers as much as to monks. Peace also became a program. Beginning in southern Gaul, bishops convened councils that proclaimed the peace of God. At Charroux in 989 and at other assemblies soon after, participants swore oaths to protect churches, clerics, merchants and peasants, and they processed relics to dramatize the claims. The movement did not end violence, but it changed its terms by naming protected persons and times, and by making violation a spiritual as well as a legal offense. That shift from private feud to public sanction created a vocabulary later rulers and reformers would use to channel warfare into custom. Reform also found a monumental language. In the Ottonian realms, court and church collaborated to build and to commission art that fused Carolingian inheritance with classical and Christian forms. Architecture at Hildesheim under Bishop Bernward offers the clearest case. The Abbey Church of St. Michael, begun around 1010, shows balanced plans and calculated light that guided processions and chant. Bronze doors and narrative sculpture from the same milieu taught doctrine in measured images. The dates nudge beyond the 10th century, but they complete the arc of Ottonian renewal, in which monasteries served as schools of art and memory for an empire that anchored authority in liturgy as well as in law. Towns and routes felt the change. Monasteries laid out granges, mills, and guest houses at river crossings and along ridge roads. Pilgrims moving to shrines found hostels and markets clustered near abbey gates, and donors expecting prayer asked for bridges, fords, and ferries to be maintained. The liturgical calendar itself moved people and goods. Feasts drew crowds into walled precincts where sellers gathered with salt, cloth, and tools, and where abbots collected stall fees that sustained schools and poor relief. Seen this way, Cluniac prayer and Gore's discipline were not withdrawals from the world, but engines that made a different kind of public possible. Writing underwrote the fabric. Scribes trained in reformed houses copied service books, saints' lives, and law in a hand descended from Carolingian minuscule, clear enough to travel between libraries without translation. Ottonian scriptoria produced gospel books and sacramentaries, whose images and initials reinforced the rhythm of the year and the rank of the altar. The page became a tool for coordination across distance. When bishops visited rural churches, they carried corrected texts that aligned local practice with wider norms, just as royal envoys in the previous century had carried capitularies. The result was not uniformity, but a recognizable family resemblance. These movements also shaped memory and politics. Lay patrons who gave land to a monastery entered its commemorative lists, to be named in prayers and remembered on their death days. In return, abbeys offered legal storage for charters, safe lodging for travelers, and a cadre of educated clerks who could staff a lord's chapel or a county court. In regions where kingship was contested or far away, that steadiness mattered. It gave communities a way to transact across generations that did not depend only on a single household's fortunes. Reform, in this light, was a social technology as much as a spiritual one. By the year 1000, the habits forged at Cluny, Gore's, and their circles had spread through networks of patronage, schooling, and example. They did not erase private war or famine. They did give rulers and towns new tools for turning conflict into rule, and they filled the calendar with occasions that tied markets to mass. The next phase of the story will follow how these monastic currents flowed into broader ecclesiastical reform, and how stone, song, and statute combined to carry Europe from frontier improvisation to the first Romanesque age. Around the year 1000, earlier rhythms hardened into wider programs of rule, worship, and building that linked cloister to court. Historians group many of these impulses under Gregorian reform, a long 11th century campaign to secure the moral integrity and independence of the clergy. The name comes from Pope Gregory VII, but the agenda predated and outlasted him. Its sharpest edge confronted lay investiture, the custom by which rulers conferred ring and staff on bishops. Conflict peaked when Gregory VII and King Henry IV collided in the 1070s, a struggle whose symbols included Canossa in 1077, and whose legal settlement, after decades of dispute and imitation abroad, came with the Concordat of Worms in 1122. The point was not ceremony alone. It was to decide who could make pastors and, through them, shape law, property, and daily discipline. Reform was also administration. Popes and their legates pressed for cleaner elections, better preaching, and corrected service books. Cathedral chapters claimed greater voice, bishops convened more frequent councils, and clerical education became a recurring priority rather than a passing enthusiasm. In this sense, the 11th century extended Carolingian habits, but scaled them through a more assertive papacy that could reach over mountains by letters and envoys. The quarrel over investiture was one part of that story. The patient work of copying, visitation, and adjudication was the rest. Fordham's medieval sourcebook preserves the papal bans on lay investiture in 1078 and 1080, which show how reformers turned ideals into articles and posted them where bishops and princes would have to answer. At the same time, Europe learned to write in stone at a new scale. The Romanesque language of buildings spread along roads and market greens. Round arches, heavy walls, thick piers, barrel and groin vaults, arcaded facades and tall towers that served as landmarks as much as belframes. Plans became more regular. In pilgrimage, churches and ambulatory wrapped the choir, feeding radiating chapels so visitors could move to relics without disrupting Mass. Guides describe these features succinctly, and they are legible on the ground from the Garonne to Galicia. The style's steadiness matters for our story because it made instruction and movement visible as form. Cluny stood near the center of this building season. Under Abbot Hugh, work began in 1088 on the vast Mea Ecclesia, the third great church at the site. With a five-aisled nave and vaults rising to about 30 meters, Cluny's church was the largest in the Latin West until the early modern rebuilding of St. Peter de Ches. Consecrations came in stages. In 1095, Urban II stood in Burgundy to dedicate the high altar on the same journey during which he preached the council at Clermont. The scale was not vanity. It expressed a program in which disciplined prayer, ordered space, and far-reaching patronage braided into a public claim about how time, memory, and resources should be used. Pilgrimage routes helped set the template. The Basilica of Saint-Sernin at Toulouse, a major stop towards Santiago, shows a textbook pilgrimage plan. Long nave, ambulatory, and a crown of radiating chapels for relics. The plan let crowds circulate while offices continued. Contemporary descriptions and modern surveys alike highlight how that circulation knit devotion to urban order, because bridges, hostels, and market strips clustered around the same gates. The great Romanesque cathedral at Santiago began in 1075 and took shape through the early 12th century, carrying the same logic to the edge of the Atlantic. If churches made the landscape legible, castles made it accountable. From the late 10th century, Motta and Bailey earthworks with timber palisades dotted river bends and ridge ends across northern France and then across the Channel. They were quick to raise, effective in channeling local obedience, and easy to staff. After 1066, the Normans seeded the English map with these mounds and, in select places, replaced timber with stone, a sequence captured in chronicles and in the ground itself from London to the Welsh March. The form spread with lordship because it turned force into routine, a watch on roads, and a place to sort dues. Urban life thickened in the same century. Old episcopal centres and crossroads markets grew, and in northern and central Italy, sworn communes emerged as coalitions of household heads and merchants who managed walls, bridges, tolls, and law. The sequence and motives varied by city, but the pattern is clear by the early 12th century, when consuls and councils in places like Pisa, Genoa, and Milan bargained with bishops and emperors as corporate actors. The commune was not a revolution against religion so much as another way to make public order when distance, rival lords, and opportunity all pressed hard. Exchange tracked these changes. Pilgrimage multiplied hostels and bridges, and with them stalls for bread, wine, cloth, and tools. In northeastern France, the Champagne fairs, which would flower fully in the 12th and 13th centuries, linked northern cloth to Mediterranean credit and spices in a predictable calendar. Even before their zenith, the habit of periodic fairs had returned, and rulers guaranteed safe conduct, scales, and courts where strangers could settle accounts. Merchant custom hardened into law, giving traveling people a way to rely on more than the goodwill of hosts. Grouping these threads does not announce a sudden dawn after darkness. It shows earlier habits maturing into portable forms. Monastic reform gave rulers reasons to endow and to expect standards. A more articulate papacy supplied a ladder of appeal that could pull disputes out of private violence. Castles located responsibility in named hands and made borderlands governable. Communes drew talent into assemblies and courts. Romanesque plans folded devotion and movement into a grammar builders could repeat from the Garonne to the Duero. The result was not uniformity, but a family resemblance that let people recognize how to build, pray, buy, and sue far from home. Seen from that angle, the investiture struggle looks less like a single calamity than a public negotiation over who would guide these instruments. Kings wanted bishops as partners who could govern and fight. Reformers insisted that pastoral office be guarded from sale and from the visible grip of lay power. The eventual compromise left both sides with tools and with constraints. In practice, it meant more writing, more law, and more places one could go to be heard. That, more than any one victory, is why the 11th century feels brighter on the page than the centuries before it. The call that reshaped the 11th century came at Clermont in November 1095, when Urban II closed a reforming synod by urging armed aid to Eastern Christians and safe passage for pilgrims. Several versions of his words survive, but they agree on the appeal and its link to earlier peace programs that tried to channel feud into public duty. Within months, preachers carried the message along roads from Burgundy to the Rhine. By 1096, armed pilgrims were moving east. 4 years later, after sieges that strained men and credit, Crusaders took Jerusalem on 15th of July 1099 and repelled a Fatimid counterattack at Ascalon, founding a kingdom and allied principalities that would bind Western courts, churches and ports to Levantine politics for generations. Shipping made that reach practical. Italian maritime communes supplied timber, crossbowmen and hulls. Genoa sent squadrons by 1097 and negotiated trading quarters after Antioch fell. Pisans and Venetians followed with large fleets in 1098 and 1099, securing privileges that moved their merchants, laws and weights to Levantine quays. These ventures were civic as well as pious, debated in assemblies and financed as public enterprises. In the next decades, treaties confirmed colonies and court access in Crusader states, and a pattern took shape in which rulers paid in customs, houses, and judicial favors for convoy, siege work, and naval supremacy. Order on the ground required new institutions. The Hospitales began as a community serving pilgrims at Jerusalem and won papal recognition in 1113. Under Raymond Dupuy, they combined care with defense and acquired castles on exposed lines, most famously Cras des Chevaliers. The Templars formed soon after 1119 and received a formal rule at Troyes in 1129, pairing vows with arms to guard roads and garrisons. Both orders used a network of Western estates to fund work overseas, turning bequests and rents into transport, garrisons, and grain. By mid-century, they were among the most literate and mobile administrators in the Mediterranean. Monastic reform also took a new course. In 1098, a group from Molesme founded Citeaux, seeking stricter Benedictine practice. Expansion followed after Bernard of Clairvaux entered in the 1110s, and daughter houses multiplied across valleys from Burgundy to Yorkshire. Cistercians preferred remote sites, a paired liturgy, and direct management of land through granges staffed by lay brothers. Their estates specialized in wool, ironworking and water power, and their charters show a capacity to reorganize scattered rights into large, efficient units. They did not invent the plow or the mill, but they made both work harder, and they linked prayer to disciplined production in ways that impressed neighbors and patrons. Agriculture itself widened. In much of northern Europe, the three-field system, with winter grains, spring crops, and a third fallow reduced risk and lifted yields relative to the older two-course pattern. Horses, fitted with a collar that shifted traction to the shoulders, increasingly pulled plows and carts. They moved faster than oxen and worked longer. Watermills multiplied along lowland streams, grinding grain and fulling cloth. The Domesday Survey of 1086 already listed more than 5,000 mills in England alone, a baseline that rose in the century that followed. These claims do not imply uniform adoption. They mark a toolbox that villages used with local sense and that reforming houses helped to standardize. Climate may have eased some of this growth. Many proxies point to relatively warm conditions across parts of the North Atlantic world, between roughly 950 and 1250, a frame often called the medieval climate anomaly. The pattern was not globally uniform, and recent work stresses regional variation and multiple causes. But for our period, the important point is that modestly milder seasons where they occurred lowered frost risk and lengthened growing windows at the margins of cultivation. In combination with new harness, rotations and mills, that background helped households turn labor into surpluses that could be taxed, endowed and traded. Architecture described this confidence in stone. Builders pushed Romanesque plans to new spans and heights in the 1090s and early 1100s, and around 1140, the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris displayed a solution that would transform church space. Under Abbot Suger, masons opened the choir into an ambulatory with radiating chapels and a skeletal wall pierced for light. Later writers called the results Gothic, but the immediate meaning is administrative. Pilgrimage flow and liturgy could run in parallel, and script, chant and sculpture were choreographed so that civic and monastic calendars aligned. Other great churches took the lesson and reworked apses and vaults to manage crowds while teaching with images. Farther south, Sicily under the Norman king Roger II offers a complementary picture. By mid-century, his court at Palermo gathered Greek, Arabic and Latin talent to govern a composite kingdom. In 1154, the geographer Al-Idrisi completed for Roger a world survey, an atlas often called the Tabula Rogeriana, drawing on travelers' reports to compile coordinates and descriptions in Arabic for a Christian ruler. The book is evidence that even in a decade marked by crusade, siege and church politics, a Mediterranean court could make cosmopolitan science part of rule. The same ports that ferried pilgrims moved books, dyes, sugar and legal customs. Behind these set pieces lay thousands of smaller adjustments. Parish clergy in England and northern France now worked within shires and dioceses whose texts were being corrected more regularly. Italian communes refined statutes that governed bridges, scales and debt. Iberian rulers bargained along frontiers where Almoravid and later Almohad movements reshaped the balance of towns and fields. Pilgrimage roads to Compostela braided these worlds. Relic feasts created fixed dates for fairs, safe conducts and tolls, and the men who counted those tolls used the same deniers and the same pages that cathedral schools taught. Reform and trade were not separate stories. They were two ways to make promised travel. So the decades after 1095 were not a single crusading trance. They were a crowded workshop. Urban's rhetoric, the new military orders, Cistercian granges, improved harness and rotations, the spread of mills, Suger's choir at St. Denis and Roger S. Atlas, each solved the same problem in a different medium, how to turn movement into order. The solutions were uneven and reversible, but they set the stage for the next wave of expansion, law and conflict that would carry Europe's argument with itself and with its neighbors into the later 12th century. Across the latter half of the 12th century, rulers and churchmen turned the tools assembled since 1000 into institutions that traveled well. Royal courts with predictable procedures, canon law texts that could be taught line by line, schools that stabilized into universities and stone churches planned to manage crowds and light. The picture is not a clean march from custom to code. It is a patchwork of experiments that hardened because people found them useful. In England, the clearest changes can be followed in the paperwork of Henry II's reign. Earlier kings had used writs and itinerant judges. Henry's reforming ordinances made that machinery regular and measurable. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 described who must make inquiry about crimes, how sheriffs and justices were to proceed, and how suspected persons were to be held for trial. Its language assumes routine circuits, sworn presentments by local juries, and a growing habit of writing things down. Later, assizes elaborated on debts, novel disseisin, and mordancester, turning landholdings and injuries into questions a royal court could hear with set forms. The result was not a single new law, but a shared procedure that made strangers legible to one another from shire to shire. Royal reach met resistance where it touched the church. The quarrel between Henry II and Thomas Becket turned on whether clerics accused of crimes should answer first in royal courts or remain under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in December 1170 shocked Europe and remade the politics of reform. Within a few years, the archbishop was canonized. By 1174, Henry performed public penance at Becket's shrine and reached a settlement that preserved the core of his legal program while conceding symbols and some church claims. Pilgrimage to Canterbury carried that memory across the Channel and into village talk. The intellectual side of reform moved just as quickly. Around 1140, a teacher known as Gratian compiled the Concordia Discordantium Canonum, later called the Decretum. It gathered thousands of canons and decretals, set them in order, and reconciled apparent contradictions with reasoned distinctions. That book did two things at once. It offered a working map of church law, and it modeled a method that students could learn, practice, and apply. Within a generation, the Decretum had become the foundational text of canon law teaching across the Latin West. Roman law returned to the public stage at the same time. In Bologna, teachers and their students read Justinian's compilation with glosses in the margins that explained terms, harmonized passages, and suggested how to argue from text to case. That practice of close reading spread outward, with pupils who took city statutes and court work as their field. The legal culture that emerged did not erase local custom. It gave merchants, bishops, and councils a Latin grammar for debate, a way to cite and compare, and a portable tool for making new bylines where roads crossed. Translation made other literatures travel. When scholars describe a 12th century Renaissance, they point as often to movement as to invention. In central Spain, after the conquest of Toledo in 1085, figures such as Gerard of Cremona worked with collaborators to turn Arabic versions of Greek science and Arabic works themselves into Latin. Gerard A.S. lists spans, Ptolemy, Zalmagest, and astronomical tables, as well as medicine and natural philosophy. The effect was cumulative. Cathedral schools and early universities gained a shelf of texts that let students compute, diagnose, and argue with references that had not been available in the Latin West a century before. Schools thickened into corporations. In Paris, the teaching clustered around the cathedral evolved by mid-century into a self-governing community of masters and students that could negotiate with bishop and crown. The form was familiar from guilds and chapters, sworn members, officers, statutes, and privileges. Paris specialized in theology, Bologna specialized in law. Both taught grammar and logic as the ladder to the higher arts. What mattered for daily life was that trained clerks now carried similar habits of reading and record-keeping into courts, chanceries, and chapters across many cities. Architecture declared the same confidence in stone. Builders who had extended Romanesque forms began to open walls with pointed arches and ribbed vaults, tying the thrust to piers and buttresses and freeing space for windows. Around 1194, the fire at Chartres forced a comprehensive rebuild on an already famous site of pilgrimage. The new church learned from recent experiments, but scaled them to a plan that organized movement and sight with remarkable clarity. Even where towns never saw a cathedral of that size, parish builders borrowed the vocabulary. and the discipline behind it, sight lines for processions, light to mark the choir, chapels to absorb crowds without halting the office. Politics did not stand still while schools and churches grew. The Angevin kings held an arc of territories from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees through a mix of inheritance, war and marriages, while the Capetian kings in Paris learned to enlarge a smaller domain by sieges, courts and alliances. In 1204, just after our period, Normandy would pass decisively to the French crown, but the struggle that produced that outcome was already underway in the 1190s as barons chose between English and French lords. These contests were not only about banners, they were about who could summon men to a ford and who could promise courts that would hold their judgments. The Crusader states remained part of that ledger. In 1187, Saladin took Jerusalem, prompting a new expedition. The Third Crusade brought Richard I of England and Philip II of France east in uneasy partnership. Siege and negotiation followed. Richard's victories on the coast restored a corridor of fortified ports, but not the Holy City. In September 1192, he and Saladin agreed to a truce that secured Christian control of a coastal strip and pilgrimage access while acknowledging the limits of conquest. The treaty's terms exemplify the period's tone: piety, logistics, and law braided into a settlement that could be maintained, counted, and renewed. Economies adjusted to these larger frames. Northern towns minted cloth and rules at the same time, fixing measures and fees so fairs could operate with less friction. Italian communes wrote statutes for bridges, weights, and debt, then used notaries trained in Roman law to register sales, dowries, and partnerships. On the seaboard, Genoa, Pisa, and Venice bargained for quarters at foreign quays and for judicial privileges that let their merchants settle disputes before their own consuls. Inland, Castellans converted wood and stone into predictable dues and safe conduct. In each place we can see why rulers and townsmen valued clerks. The new document standardized weights, names, and obligations so that strangers could trade and sue. None of this erased risk. Dearth and disease returned often enough to keep granaries and hospitals busy. Private war remained a habit, even when bishops and counts tried to deter it with oaths, bans, and sanctuary rules. Yet the 12th century signature is the thickness of tools people could reach for when shocks came. A sheriff could call a jury to name suspects under forms the king's judges would recognize. A bishop could cite the decretum to justify a ruling on marriage or orders. A merchant could take a notarial copy of a contract from Pisa to Acre and expect a court to hear it. A master could leave Paris with a letter of fraternity and find students elsewhere ready to pay for lectures on the same books. By 1200, a traveler crossing from Kent to the Seine or from the Loire to the Rhône would have met landscapes that felt increasingly legible: castles marking responsibility, chapter houses, training clerks, roads timed to fairs, and feasts and churches planned around movement and light. The next turn in the story will follow how this institutional density met new conflicts over empire and papacy, how towns asserted themselves with fresh confidence, and how law books and building sites together carried Europe into the 13th century. Around 1200, the instruments of rule assembled since the 11th century shaped daily life with new steadiness. Royal courts rode circuits with written forms. Chapters and communes kept minutes, seals, and statutes. Schools gathered masters and students into sworn bodies that could negotiate with bishops and princes. Leaders learned to work through these tools rather than around them. At Rome, Innocent III described the papacy as a care of souls that reached from parish altars to royal councils. In France, Philip II pressed his claims with audits and sieges. In England, John's contested rule forced barons to test the limits of kingship in writing. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 gave this climate its clearest map. Bishops and abbots met under papal summons and approved canons that set shared expectations for the Latin West. Clergy were to preach regularly and live under discipline that could be inspected. Every Christian was to confess and communicate at least once each year. Bishops were charged to establish schools and ensure that parish instruction reached beyond rote. The council clarified rules on marriage and the sacraments, defined procedures for judging heresy, and insisted on decent church provision. Canonists had long arranged texts, but Lateran made that learning a public expectation and tied it to inspection and appeal. The council also shows how far papal reach could travel. Innocent claimed overlordship in Sicily, mediated imperial and royal elections, confirmed disputed agreements, and punished princes who refused correction. Effects were uneven, yet they taught a habit of argument. Even critics hired canonists and wrote briefs. They appealed in the language of right and remedy, rather than only in the language of feud. Letters of commission and judges delegated from Rome created a ladder by which cases could climb from village to cathedral and onto the curia, where sentences were recorded and circulated as examples. War and law intertwined in France. Philip's long contest with the Angevin kings culminated in 1214 at Bouvines, where his army defeated a coalition led by Otto IV and allied princes. The victory secured Normandy and much of the former Angevin mainland for the French crown, weakened magnates who had bargained like near equals, and supplied a rallying story for Capetian legitimacy. The outcome rested on years of administrative work. Bailiffs audited accounts and supervised provosts. Royal courts gained reach, and written inquiries checked abuse. The king's domain expanded not only by arms, but by paperwork that made rents, offices, and rights more legible. Across the Channel, a different consolidation followed failure. King John demanded scutage to pay for lost wars, exploited feudal incidents with unusual hardness, and quarreled with the church. Barons and prelates rebelled. In 1215, they forced a meeting at Runnymede that produced a long charter. Its clauses rehearsed familiar themes. No free man was to be imprisoned or disseised without lawful judgment by his peers or by the law of the land. Reliefs and amercements were to be proportionate. Extraordinary taxation required counsel. Reissues in 1216, 1217, and 1225 trimmed or confirmed the text. The habit mattered most. Disputes now reached for parchment, seals, and sworn enforcement clauses, and the common law gained firmer roots. The empire added another rhythm. After Otto fell from favor, Frederick II became king and then emperor in 1220. His governments in Germany and in Sicily moved on different schedules. North of the Alps, princes held strong local rights, and imperial peace rested on bargains, diets, and written truces. In the south, the crown pressed for direct rule through salaried officials and royal courts. In 1231, just beyond our frame, Frederick issued a comprehensive code at Melfi for the Sicilian kingdom. The code reflected a program already visible in the 12 and 20s, in which legislation and bureaucracy defined royal authority more clearly than lineage alone. Universities matured within this climate. Paris and Bologna secured privileges from popes and princes that recognized collective rights of masters and students, including freedom to travel, exemption from local courts in teaching matters, and protection for academic property. The curriculum stabilized. Art students read Aristotle and argued with commentaries recently translated from Arabic and Greek. Canonists and civilians glossed law books and trained notaries who filled chanceries from Lisbon to Krakow. Theologians fitted authorities into ordered summaries that organized questions and answers for classroom use. Degrees marked competence, and letters of fraternity made skills portable along the same roads that carried cloth and coin. New religious movements broadened pastoral capacity. The Dominicans won papal recognition in 1216, and the Franciscans received a formal rule in 1223. Both orders moved easily through towns. They preached, taught, and heard confessions, and they supplied inquisitors when councils authorized them. They also helped knit schools to parishes, since friars took chairs in theology and carried classroom method to the pulpit. Admirers praised their zeal and learning. Critics worried about privilege and novelty. Either way, the orders altered the urban soundscape, mixing chant with lessons and drawing new crowds into a regular habit of instruction and care. Economies answered to these institutions. Champagne fairs reached a mature cycle under princely guarantees and linked northern cloth to Mediterranean spice and credit. In Italian ports, notaries recorded partnerships and marine insurance in a language shaped by Roman law. Inland, written customs fixed tolls, weights, and the terms of debt. Hanseatic ties among Baltic and North Sea towns deepened as merchants standardized measures and pooled defense. Taxes grew more regular because rulers could estimate wealth and councils learned to bargain, and the counting rooms of churches and castles kept better books. Architecture kept pace with confidence and conflict. After the fire of 1194, Chartres' rebuild set a model of plans and light. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults and buttresses opened walls for windows taught in glass. Meanwhile, crusading shifted maps, as conquest at Constantinople in 1204 created Latin principalities ruled by charters and courts. By the late 1220s, the climate of institutions was set, and Europe carried its arguments forward with texts, councils and stones. In the 1230s, rulers treated parchment as an instrument no less than the sword. Nowhere is this clearer than in the south, where Frederick II gathered jurists at Melfi and issued a comprehensive code for the Kingdom of Sicily. Known as the Constitutions of Melfi or Liber Augustalis, the text reorganized courts, offices and penalties in a way that drew openly on Roman and canon law. It was centralizing, prescriptive, and meant to be read aloud and enforced by salaried officials. That ambition set a tone for other governments that wished to make authority visible in statutes rather than only in custom. Church law advanced in parallel. In 1234, Pope Gregory IX promulgated an authorized collection of papal decretals that systematized earlier rulings and supplied classrooms with a stable reference point. Canonists could now cite X with confidence that judges across dioceses would recognize the passage and the logic behind it. The same decade saw lay compilations that captured local norms and shaped them for new courts. In the German lands, Eike von Repgau, S. Sachsenspiegel, summarized Saxon custom in the early 13th century and circulated in both Latin and German. In Castile, royal jurists under Alfonso the Fecus worked between 1256 and 1265 to reshape earlier materials into the Siete Partidas, a long code that mixed law with moral instruction and a theory of royal office. Across the Channel and the Seine, kings turned similar tools to local ends. In France, Louis IX joined piety to procedure. He strengthened the crown's court, the Parlement of Paris, and issued ordinances that curbed private war, stabilized coinage, and limited judicial combat. The effect was cumulative. Plaintiffs gained a place to appeal beyond baronial halls, and royal officers learned to record, inspect, and correct. The Crown's moral posture and administrative habits became part of the same program. England's path ran through confrontation. After John's troubled reign, Henry III faced baronial demands for reform. In 1258, the provisions of Oxford forced a council of supervision on the king and set out procedures for appointing ministers and holding them to account. When that settlement collapsed, civil war followed. Simon de Montfort's ascendancy in 1264 to 1265 included an enlarged assembly that later tradition remembered as a landmark in parliamentary practice. The war ended with his defeat, yet the habit of stating remedies in charters and of summoning broader councils endured as a way to argue about power. These legal constructions faced an unexpected test. when mounted archers poured into Central Europe from the east. In 1241, Mongol armies struck at two fronts. They defeated Polish and Allied forces at Legnica and crushed the Hungarian host on the Sajo at Mohi. Withdrawal after 1242 spared the region from occupation, but the shock reordered priorities. Fortifications multiplied, rulers reconsidered cavalry and scouting, and chroniclers learned new names for commanders and tactics. The line of advance toward Egypt, however, met a different outcome. In 1260, the Mamluk army won a decisive victory at Ain Jalut, halting Mongol expansion into the Nile Valley. By century's end, Mamluk pressure had dismantled the remaining Crusader strongholds on the Levantine coast, culminating in the fall of Acre in 1291. Violence thus shifted maps, while other Mongol effects opened roads. Under a vast empire that ran from the Pacific to the Danube, caravan routes saw fewer tolls and safer relays. Later writers called the pattern the Pax Mongolica, and although the phrase is modern, the experience of easier long-distance movement is clear in the careers of merchants and envoys. Marco Polo's journey between 1271 and 1295, and his account of service at the court of Kublai Khan, are vivid signals of that connectivity. Latin readers met new lists of goods and cities, and Western notaries absorbed fresh terms for weights, measures, and coinage. Towns on Europe's northern rim organized themselves for this wider traffic. Merchant communities around the Baltic and North Sea formed leagues to standardize dues, protect convoys, and negotiate privileges with princes. The Hanseatic League's early associations in the 13th century linked port to river mouth and warehouse to weighing room. In the southwest, overland fairs in Champagne reached their height in the same age, acting as scheduled clearinghouses for cloth credit and spices under princely guarantees, even as maritime routes and rising Atlantic ports began to draw some business away by the century's close. The pulse of trade was still set by calendars, but it now beat in more places and through more courts. Banking made counting rooms as important as castles. Florentine houses expanded across Europe with branches and agents who combined exchange, deposit, and credit. The Peruzzi and the Bardi were already prominent by the late 13th century, serving princes and popes and posting balances between fairs and ports. Their fortunes would swing with war and default in the next century, but their reach before 1300 signals how financial expertise had become a form of governance in its own right. Ideas and images moved just as far. At Paris, Oxford, and elsewhere, the university course settled into a rhythm of arts, followed by theology or law. And in the 1260s, Thomas Aquinas composed the Summa Theologiae as a structured handbook for disputation and preaching. He wrote in a prose designed for classrooms, fitting authorities into ordered questions so that a master could guide students from premise to conclusion. Cathedrals and chapels mirrored that clarity in stone and glass. In 1248, the Royal Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris presented walls dissolved into windows and a liturgical choreography suited to relics and to crowds, a model of rayonnant design that other builders imitated. Even small instruments recalibrated daily life. The magnetic compass, described in Europe by the 13th century, let pilots hold a course when sky and shoreline failed, while the first eyeglasses in Italy allowed readers and scribes to extend working years for copying and account-keeping. Large tower clocks belong mostly to the decades after 1300, yet the experiments that made them possible were already underway, part of a late medieval fascination with measuring and coordinating time in parish and market. Together, these devices made distance and age less absolute. What stands out in this century is not a single victory, but the density of tools that rulers, merchants, clerics, and townspeople could use when fortune shifted. A royal ordinance could be cited beside a local custumal and a papal decretal. A contract notarized in one port could be presented in another with some hope of recognition. A preacher could appeal to a canon and to a summer. A shipmaster could steer by a needle on days when neither wind nor coastline offered guidance. These habits stitched regions together, even as wars and raids pulled them apart. On the eve of 1300, Europe's map looked thick with courts and houses and keys, each with its own bell and its own books, all learning to keep time with their neighbors. The next segment will follow how this busy order met famine, plague, and war, and how the same reliance on texts, offices, and markets both cushioned and magnified the shocks that came. The 14th century opens with a run of bad harvests that historians now treat as the first great shock to a crowded agrarian order. From 1315 through 1317, persistent rains, cool summers, and animal disease wrecked the cereal cycle across much of northern Europe. Grain withered in the fields, hay would not cure, and fodder failed. Prices spiked, stores collapsed, and many districts faced hunger and disease together. Chroniclers note theft, vagrancy, and desperate acts. Manorial accounts record missing rents and dead stock. The Great Famine, as scholars call it, did not kill as fast as plague would later do, but it thinned bodies and lowered resilience in the years just before new wars and epidemics arrived. Climate work and narrative sources agree on the scale. This was a weather shock that rippled through demography, politics, and trust. War returned with new patterns. In 1337, conflict that we label the 100 Years. War began to reshape the politics of the Channel and the Loire. When Edward III's army met a larger French host near Crécy in 1346, disciplined infantry tactics and longbow volleys shattered mounted charges. The engagement showed how training, position, and projectile weapons could blunt the charge of armored elites. It also set up the siege and capture of Calais, which remained an English foothold for 2 centuries. Gunpowder made a cameo in some accounts, a sign of experiments that would matter more in siegecraft later than in this field battle itself. The larger point is institutional. Levy systems, field logistics, and tax bargains grew around campaigns that had to be paid for in coin and grain. The blow that followed moved by ship and flee. Between 1347 and 1351, a wave of plague swept from the Black Sea through Mediterranean ports into the Atlantic rims. Mortality varied by town and region, but in many places a third or more of the population died within months. Texts from the time groped for causes and remedies. Modern biology has confirmed the pathogen as Yersinia pestis by retrieving its DNA from graves dated to the first European wave, a finding that anchors medieval testimony in molecular evidence. That science places the 14th century organism close to the root of later plague lineages, explaining why subsequent outbreaks could recur for centuries. Institutions improvised. In some ports, authorities prohibited arrivals from infected places from entering the city until a fixed number of days had passed. The earliest surviving statute of this kind is from Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, in 1377. Councillors required a period of isolation at offshore stations before travelers or goods could enter the harbour. Later, city statutes extended the waiting period and created permanent facilities. But the initial step already shows the logic of public health. Defend commerce and community together by inserting time between contact and access. Public order frayed, and fear sharpened scapegoating. Across parts of the Rhineland and the Alps, crowds accused Jews of poisoning wells and staged pogroms in 1348 and 1349. Papal chancery letters under Clement VI condemned the violence and reminded bishops that contagion did not trace to any single community. But the orders were unevenly obeyed, and killings proceeded in many towns. The documents and later research together show the dismal pattern. Rumor traveled faster than correction, and rulers struggled to make their writ protect the vulnerable when panic paid politically. The labor market told the next chapter. With population abruptly lower and land unchanged, survivors could ask more for their work or move to better terms. Seigneurs and councils answered by trying to fix wages and bind movement. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers of 1349 and the Statute of Labourers of 1351 set pre-plague wage levels as a ceiling and penalised refusal of work at customary pay. Enforcement was patchy and contested, but the statutes matter because they show governments using national legislation to shape local bargains and because they fed resentments that later flared. Rebellion followed, where taxation, war losses and labour regulation met. In northern France, the Jacquerie of 1358 erupted amid royal crisis and foreign invasion. Peasants and townspeople attacked manors and symbols of elite power, and the revolt was crushed within weeks with severe reprisals. England's peasants' revolt in 1381, sparked by poll taxes and long frustration with labour controls, seized London briefly and demanded an end to serfdom and oppressive dues before it too was suppressed after the killing of Wat Tyler. Neither revolt remade the social order at once, yet both shifted the conversation about obligation, mobility, and the limits of coercion. If we follow households instead of courts, we can see quieter adjustments. Many villages reorganized holdings to suit smaller families and a scarcer workforce. Women's participation in market labor became more visible in some records, especially in spinning, brewing, and service, though law and guild customs still constrained advancement. Guilds in towns recalibrated entry fees and training lengths, balancing protection with the need for hands. Parish fraternities took on more charity and burial duties. Hospitals multiplied. In accounting roles, we see fewer tenants but more cash per head, more leasing out of domain, and more ad hoc bargains that speak to local agency inside a legal frame set by Crown and Council. War did not stop for plague. After Crécy and Poitiers, truces and chevauchés punctuated the long struggle between Valois kings and the Plantagenet line. Finance settled into routines that later states would inherit. Indirect taxes on wine and salt, direct levies negotiated in assemblies, and short-term loans floated on the promise of future receipts. These habits hardened administrative offices and drew more scribes into counting rooms. The point for social history is that even shocks as large as famine and plague did not reset the calendar alone. They sped transitions that were already underway in how rulers raised money, how towns defended privilege, and how law was argued. Ideas answered the century's grief and argument in many registers. Preachers and penitential movements tried to give meaning to loss. Some processions and flagellant groups moved town to town, seeking divine attention through public discipline. University masters refined pastoral handbooks and sermons. Vernacular writers folded catastrophe into narrative and satire, giving later readers a sense of both pain and adaptability. That intellectual labor belongs in the same ledger as quarantine and labor law. People were building tools for living with uncertainty. Some spiritual, some institutional, most negotiated in public. The century's technology nudged practice forward as well. Firearms that were marginal at Crécy gained more value in sieges by the 1370s and 1380s, changing wall design and the career of the engineer. Paper, cheaper than parchment, widened the range of offices that could keep files. Eyeglasses prolonged the working life of readers and clerks. A small change with large aggregate effect in a culture that now relied on the written page for most kinds of authority. None of these inventions began in this decade, but their adoption quickened because institutions had reason to count, inspect, and remember. The 14th century, then, is not only a chain of disasters. It is a stress test that reveals how communities used the grammar of charters, councils, and courts to bend without breaking. Famine and war stripped reserves. Plague struck hard and often. Yet councils learned to time quarantines, bishops argued against scapegoats even when they could not stop violence, and statutes contested and revised, became the arena in which labour and lordship argued their future. The next segment will cross into the first half of the 15th century, where war, revolt and recovery reshaped kingdoms again, and where the same habit of writing rule down opened space for new settlements. At the century's turn, the Church settled a quarrel that had divided Europe for a generation. The Council of Constance met between 1414 and 1418 and manoeuvred through resignations and depositions to elect Oddone Colonna as Pope Martin V in November 1417. The act ended the Western Schism in practice and reset the habits of appeal, visitation, and clerical oversight that had frayed since the late 14th century. For our purposes, the key change is administrative. Bishops and princes could again assume a single Roman ladder of authority when they argued about benefices, marriage cases, and discipline. The truce inside the church did not cure every rivalry, but it simplified the map of jurisdiction. War still structured much of public life. In 1415, Henry V reopened the Anglo-French struggle with victories that became common talk from parish to port. Agincourt's field on October 25th showed what disciplined infantry and archers could do against mounted elites. The triumph fed Henry's wider program, which reached its legal peak in 1420 when the Treaty of Troyes named him regent and heir to the French throne and arranged his marriage to Catherine of Valois. Law and force walked together. The treaty sought to bind succession to conquest, to be confirmed in courts and in ceremonies, as well as in siege lines. The script changed within a decade. In 1429, a young captain from the Meuse Plain helped lift the siege of Orléans and carried the Dauphin to Reims for consecration as Charles VII. Chroniclers fix May 8, 1429, as the day Orléans was relieved. By July, Charles had received his anointing in the cathedral where French kings traditionally began their reign. The politics that followed were hard and uneven, and Joan herself would be captured in 1430 and executed in 1431. But the combination of morale, logistics, and a better organized court let Charles rebuild authority where parchment had seemed to belong to his enemies. What made that rebuild durable were reforms that turned the King's armies from ad hoc levies into standing formations. Beginning at the estates meetings of the 1430s and confirmed by ordinances in the 1440s, the Crown regularized taxation and recruitment. In 1445, the compagnies d'ordonnance appear as permanent, paid units of heavy cavalry. 3 years later, the Crown ordered parish archers, the Frank archers, to train and stand ready as a militia. The effect was to reduce dependence on roving mercenary bands and to make violence legible to royal officers, who could plan garrisons and circuits as they planned tails and audits. Artillery made these policies visible in the field. Brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau developed an artillery service that coordinated foundries, powder, transport and gunners. The result appears most clearly in 1453 at Castillon, where a fortified French battery broke an English relief attack and ended the long war as a practical matter. Accounts emphasize a park of guns sited behind earthworks and screened by archers. The lesson was not simply technology, it was administration. Powder, barrels, teams, and pay had to arrive on schedule, which required the same files and officers that kept the new companies fed. While the French crown consolidated, the Burgundian dukes built a different kind of state in the Low Countries. Philip the Good ruled a mosaic of counties and duchies stitched together by marriage, purchase, and conquest. He relied on councils, chambers of accounts, and pageants to gather consent and display rule. In 1430, at Bruges, he founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, a chivalric company that bound regional elites to his court with ritual and privilege. The Order's chapters and the dukes, patronage of painters and musicians, advertised a regime that made magnificence a form of government and commerce a partner of war. Inside towns, these changes sounded like bells for musters and for markets. Bruges and other Flemish cities remained brokers of cloth, credit and news, and Burgundian efforts to convene estates across their lands taught merchants and magistrates to argue in assemblies that resembled those of kings. The result was not centralization without protest. Cities defended privileges, languages and weights, yet the very resistance took the form of petitions, embassies and written compacts that could be filed, copied and cited. The Low Countries became a workshop in how to turn many customs into shared procedures. Far to the southeast, events in 1453 redrew the Mediterranean. Mehmed II surrounded Constantinople with troops and ships, sighted heavy cannon against the land walls, and after a long bombardment took the city on May 29th. Contemporary and modern accounts agree on the artillery's role and on the planning that preceded the assault, from the building of Rumeli fortress to the movement of pieces and supplies. The fall ended the last Roman polity and shifted the balance of ports and pilgrimages, but it also told Western princes that stone alone no longer guaranteed a city. Walls now required guns of their own, magazines, and money. Atlantic shores, meanwhile, felt a quieter transformation. After the Portuguese capture of Ceuta in 1415, princes and shipmasters mapped routes to Madeira and the Azores and refined rigs that could beat to windward. The small, quick caravel, with its lateen sails and shallow draft, proved fit for coasts and rivers, and able to make offshore passages when square canvas was added. These experiments were not yet voyages to India. They were a way to learn winds, to test colonization on islands, and to add sugar and dyes to the ledgers that already linked Flemish cloth to Mediterranean spice. England's story bent inward after 1453. With continental holdings lost and a young king on the throne, rival magnate networks slid from council quarrels to open war. The series, later called the Wars of the Roses, broke out in 1455 and ran by pulses of truce and battle for 30 years. What matters for our theme is again procedural. Both Yorkist and Lancastrian regimes relied on letters patent, commissions of array, and parliamentary statutes to proclaim legitimacy and raise men. Even civil war used the grammar of office and seal that the 12th and 13th centuries had taught. By the late 1450s, the tools that would carry Europe into a new age were already in daily use. Courts could appeal to a single Roman see. Kings could tax more predictably and field-paid units. Gun founders and treasurers worked to calendars, not only to banners. Courts like Burgundy's turned magnificence into discipline that provincial elites understood. Ports from Lisbon to Bruges timed convoys to fair days and to seasons of wind. None of this erased hunger or feud. It did make responses repeatable. The 15th century's first half thus reads less like a pause between disasters than like a rehearsal in which institutions learned to keep time with powder, parchment and tide. The closing decades of the 15th century feel like a hinge in our long night, when the rhythm of European life began to quicken in ways a village bell could not measure. A single workshop in Mainz showed what was possible. Around 1455, Johannes Gutenberg's press produced a Latin Bible in crisp 42-line columns, a feat of metal, oil, paper and discipline that became a model and a lure for others. Printers soon clustered in Nuremberg and Venice. In 1493, the Nuremberg Chronicle fused universal history with hundreds of woodcuts in a spectacular encyclopedic folio. In Venice, Aldus Manutius built a press that gathered ancient authors into tidy volumes and refined type, a craft culmination that would later yield the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily in 1499. The same city would soon teach readers to carry learning in the hand rather than on a lectern. While type clicked in German and Italian shops, a different kind of unification hardened in Iberia. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 created a dynastic partnership that by 1479 produced a joint sovereignty people later called Spain. Their reign pursued order and religious unity with equal vigor. Siege lines tightened around Granada through 1491, and on January 2nd, 1492, Muhammad V, remembered as Boabdil, surrendered the Nasrid capital, ending centuries of Muslim rule on the peninsula. The pageantry of banners and keys masked the scale of transition that would follow in lower courts and village mosques. Treaties had promised free exercise of worship to surrendered Muslim communities in earlier centuries, and even in 1492, initial terms for Granada implied guarantees. Policy hardened almost at once. The Inquisition, authorized in 1478, found new scope, and on March 31st, 1492, the Crown issued the edict normally called the Alhambra Decree, ordering Jews to convert or depart. Contemporary letters and the text of the decree convey the speed and bluntness of the change. The result was a mix of conversion, flight and confiscation, and a long afterlife of suspicion directed at converts, the conversos. The gap between battle terms and parish practice mattered as much to daily life as banners on a tower. Across the border in Portugal, John II gathered royal power and looked outward. In 1482, the Crown planted a stone fortress and warehouse at Elmina on the Gulf of Guinea, a commercial hinge between European demand and West African suppliers. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias came home with news that he had rounded the stormy southern tip of Africa. In 1494, Castile and Portugal negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas to parcel spheres in the Atlantic. 3 years later, Vasco da Gama sailed from Lisbon, and by 1498 he was buying pepper and ginger at Calicut, returning in 1499 with proof that one could reach India by sea and evade Levantine toll gates. These routes rested on older Atlantic experiments and on a new kind of plantation. From the 1440s onward, sugar cane on Madeira and later on São Tomé tied mills, water power and forced labor to Atlantic weather. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans to work cane fields in Cape Verde and Madeira. São Tomé became a laboratory for tropical monoculture that would spread with tragic speed in the next century. The new Guinea fort at Elmina was not only for metal and cloth, but also for captive human beings. Iberian conquest and sugar's economics met on ocean winds, and the consequences would radiate far beyond the 15th century. If the western horizon opened, the eastern Mediterranean bristled. Mehmed II drew the last Byzantine outpost at Trebizond into the Ottoman fold in 1461, and war with Venice from 1463 to 1479 ended with the loss of Negroponte and tribute that bit the pride of a merchant republic. In the summer of 1480, an Ottoman fleet took Otranto in southern Italy, a brief but alarming occupation that ended the next year, yet left a memory of a minaret where a campanile had stood. The sea lanes of the Aegean and Ionian became a chessboard of corsairs, convoys and fortress governors. To the north and east, the balance of Eurasian tribute shifted without a set battle. Ivan III absorbed Novgorod in 1478, dismantling its republican bell and redistributing its lands. 2 years later, along the Ugra River, his army faced the Great Horde and did not yield. The standoff ended with the horde's withdrawal, a sign that Muscovy no longer accepted the older logic of payments and punishments. Chronicles remembered the Ugra as the end of the yoke, and it functioned as such, whether or not arrows flew thick that autumn. In the fragmented Holy Roman Empire, a statesman-ease answer to private feud and piecemeal justice emerged at Worms in 1495. There the estates and Maximilian Wine agreed to an eternal peace against feuding, a common penny tax and a new high tribunal, the Reichskammergericht, whose mixed bench spoke for the empire as a legal body rather than for the person of the emperor. These reforms did not end local wars, but they gave jurists new levers and subjects new pathways to appeal. And they signaled that imperial governance could be written into rules. Dynastic arithmetic reshaped the Northwest as well. The Burgundian dream unraveled when Charles the Bold fell in battle in 1477. His daughter Mary married Maximilian of Habsburg that same year, carrying the Low Countries and Franche-Comté into a Habsburg orbit even as Burgundy proper fell to the French crown. Between 1474 and 1477, the Swiss had bloodied Burgundian arms at Héricourt, Morat and Nancy, acquiring a reputation for disciplined infantry that princes from Naples to Vienna would soon hire. In 1499, the old Swiss Confederacy fought the Swabian League to a draw on the Rhine and negotiated peace at Basel, widening its de facto autonomy from imperial courts. From the east, Matthias Corvinus of Hungary kept a paid field force known to later chroniclers as the Black Army, taxed nobles with a firm hand, and built a library that made humanists gasp. But his death in 1490 reopened the central Danube to Habsburg claims and Ottoman pressure. In Prussia, the Second Peace of Thorn in 1466 humbled the Teutonic Order, made Western Prussia part of the Polish crown, and bound the rest to serve as a Polish fief, a settlement that redirected Baltic politics for a century. Borders in these years did not rest. They shifted to the tempo of succession and siege. In France, Louis XV used taxes, a courier network, and shrewd patronage to knit regions to the crown and reduce the leverage of magnates. His successors soon looked across the Alps. In 1494, Charles VIII marched into Italy, took Naples swiftly, and discovered how quickly a league of neighbors could form against a proud intruder. The Italian wars began, and with them the long habit of turning the peninsula into a proving ground for artillery, mercenary pikes, and diplomatic finesse. The same campaign loosed Girolamo Savonarola's moral thunder in Florence. He spoke to a city that had expelled the Medici and sought a more godly life, at least for a season. England, bruised by the Wars of the Roses, found a frugal restorer in Henry Tudor, who won at Bosworth in 1485, and married Elizabeth of York to fuse rival lines. He preferred treaties to campaigns and hoarded coin to reinsure peace. Institutional measures remembered under the name Star Chamber reflected an urge to check over mighty subjects and to make law a tool for central rule. It was not a theatrical monarchy, but it was a stable one, and in a continent of shifting fronts that counted. If we return to books, we see how tools and horizons met on the page. The Aldine press in Venice would soon cut an italic type and issue pocket-sized octavos, notably Virgil in 1501, a production choice that implied a different kind of reader and a different geography of learning. The Nuremberg Chronicle still looked like a medieval world dressed in new woodcuts. The Aldine octavo looked like a modern pocket. Around 1490, the Thurn and Taxis Post began to knit imperial roads into a routine service, turning letters into a dependable current. Ideas now moved with the speed of a good horse and a clean relay. By the year 1500, a mapmaker could draw Europe with firmer lines, and a merchant could imagine profits that rode winds beyond the sight of shore. A parish priest could complain about a pamphlet that traveled faster than a synod, and a prince could reach a distant cousin with a seal and a courier rather than a trumpet. Yet our through line remains the same. What we call the end of the Dark Ages was not a morning that burst over a sleeping field. It was a slow brightening in workshops, chancelleries and harbours, each adjusting to new pressures and new routes as the 15th century yielded to the 16th. Around 1500, the habits built since the 11th century met larger scales. Printing houses set type by oil lamp and sold sheets to readers who had never owned a book. Cannon forced builders to think in angles and earth rather than in sheer height. Ocean pilots learned winds that carried a hull outward by the trades and home by the westerlies. None of this arrived from nowhere. Each shift grew from a culture of counting, timing and writing that earlier centuries had assembled in courts, cloisters, ports and markets. And the tools were medieval. The range was new. Printing turned argument into a current that rulers could not halt with a single order. In 1517, a friar in Saxony framed objections to indulgence, preaching in the language of theology and pastoral care. He addressed bishops and scholars. Printers addressed anyone who could pay a few coins. Pamphlets and broadsheets multiplied his points in German and Latin, and presses in Augsburg, Nuremberg and Basel worked on sermons, replies and summaries of law. News traveled along the same roads that carried cloth and coin. Debate learned to keep time with the post. The immediate change was not doctrine alone, but the physics of public life, since readers in towns and villages could now enter a quarrel as quickly as councillors and abbots. Law followed the press into the street. Imperial safe conducts, edicts against heresy, and town statutes on preaching appeared in the same type as sermons and rebuttals. Reading became a shared act that clerks could supervise and neighbors could contest. University habits of question and answer migrated from lecture halls into parish yards. When princes gathered at a diet to resolve a suit or to weigh a doctrinal quarrel, they found that news had arrived ahead of them and that audiences wanted reasons they could copy and carry away. As in the Carolingian age, rule traveled on paper. But now, the paper multiplied itself. Warfare digested the same pressures. The Italian wars taught Europe how to attack and defend cities rebuilt for guns. Low curtain walls and angled bastions forced artillery into careful set pieces, and finance followed suit. A siege that lasted months demanded powder, ladders, wagons, and pay chests that arrived on a schedule. The sack of Rome in 1527 shocked contemporaries because it revealed the cost when payroll failed and discipline dissolved in a sacred city. It also showed how far field armies now ranged and how heavily they leaned on money, wagons and magistrates who could keep accounts in a crisis. Ottoman policy made the point at a wider scale. Earlier victories had joined Cairo and the holy cities to the Sultan's map. In the 1520s, Ottoman forces defeated a Hungarian host at Mohacs and tested the Habsburg frontier on the Danube. The army moved with gun teams, Janissary infantry, and cavalry bound by fief and service. Diplomacy did not vanish. Venetian merchants still bargained in Levantine harbors, and capitulations set terms for exchange and jurisdiction. Yet the reach of campaign and the rhythm of supply told every court in Europe that geography had changed. Sea lanes, river corridors, and fortified valleys became the true borders, because that is where money and men could be counted. Ocean routes altered time just as sharply. Portuguese captains fixed forts on Atlantic islands and at African river mouths, and then carried that habit into the Indian Ocean. Governors at Goa and Malacca turned royal orders into systems of warehouses, customs posts, and patrols. Spice that once passed through many brokers to reach Mediterranean quays now moved in fleets that a single crown tried to schedule. Spanish pilots sailed west into lands they learned in stages from guides and rivals. Reports described cities, alliances, and epidemics that remade entire regions. The exchange of crops and animals had begun to change diets on both sides of the ocean. Horses appeared where they had been unknown. Maize and beans traveled where winter had once pressed harder. The ledger that measured these routes was familiar. The distances were not. What did this look like in a parish far from a court or a fort? In some regions, councils ordered every baptism, marriage and burial to be recorded in a book kept near the altar. The life cycle itself became part of public memory. Preachers used vernacular handbooks and sermon collections that presses supplied at modest cost. Readers pinned printed almanacs and devotional sheets to beams in kitchens and shops. Guilds argued whether a printer should be regulated like a scribe or like a metal worker. Schoolmasters taught boys to pass a page that had the same clear lines from town to town. Even sleep changed when bells kept company with clocks and calendars, printed dates for fasts, fairs and courts. Continuity runs through these changes. Charters still defined rights. Courts still heard neighbors name suspects under oath. Bishops still visited and corrected. Markets still met on set feast days. What shifted was the thickness of the lines that connected one valley to the next and one coast to another. A village might still live by cattle, oats and wool, but it now received news, books and coins, stamped with unfamiliar names. A council that once copied a statute by hand could now order a dozen printed copies and send them to wardens with instructions. The mesh of custom tightened without losing the memory of how it had been woven. Historians draw the end of the Middle Ages in different places. Some mark 1453 for the fall of a city, or 1492 for the fall of a kingdom and the opening of Atlantic routes. Others prefer 1517 or 1521 to signal a new kind of religious quarrel and a new kind of public. The exact hinge matters less than the thread through it. The instruments that later centuries used to build states, churches and markets were assembled in the long period we have traced. Monasteries taught timekeeping and copying. Carolingian capitularies modeled rule by article. Frontier marches trained lords to balance tolls and defense. Emporia made strangers legible to one another with scales and seals. Those devices did not vanish, they scaled. If the old label Dark Ages misleads, it is because it suggests a pause between lights. The evidence shows a chain of workshops, courts and choirs that learned to keep record under pressure. That culture preserved letters through dearth and plague. It adapted when raiders changed coasts and when frontiers moved. It refitted belief and law to new patrons without losing the memory of old forms. By the early 16th century, those habits met materials and routes that multiplied their force. The press lent voices to many rooms. The gun made stone learn new shapes. The ship taught roads to cross salt water and return. The long night was never a single shade. It was a sky with many lamps, some hidden and some bright, carried by ordinary people as well as by rulers. A mason fitting ashlar at a gatehouse, a woman brewing ale for a market day, a clerk ruling lines for a parish register, a shipmaster judging a wind by the smell of salt, all worked inside patterns the whole society could feel. That is what endured. The 15th and early 16th centuries widened the room in which such work mattered. Printers bound that room with paper. Captains sounded it with leaden line. Councils measured it with statutes that could be copied on demand. This is where our narrative closes. It has followed tools rather than heroes, because tools show what survives shock. The early Middle Ages taught Europe how to use writing to bind space, how to turn prayer into public order, and how to fit law to travel. The centuries that followed taught it how to do these things faster and farther. By the 1530s, a trader could carry a printed ordinance in one pocket and a purse of coins in the other. A priest could hold a register and a vernacular sermon, and a captain could sail by needle on a dark sea and keep time by a page. The world did not suddenly wake. It learned to keep watch.